Good evening, everyone. Linda, thanks for that really nice introduction. You make us all sound much smarter than we are. Well, me at least. I won't say that for my panel. You make me sound a lot smarter than I am. And so nice to see so many of you all here. I will sort of moderate this panel discussion and do my best to make it lively and engaging. But I'm going to need some of your help to do that. So the rough plan we have is I've got a set of questions that I will throw out to the panel here. I expect some of the responses will trigger one panelist or another to comment on someone else's reaction, and I think that's wonderful. So you all should talk amongst yourselves over the course of this. And we'll do that until 7 o'clock or so, and then at that point we'll switch and start doing some more questions from you all. That said, we're doing this for you, so if you just have a burning question or something that Mary or Lynn says is just so brilliant that you want to stand up and applaud or comment on, please feel free to do so and we'll fit that in. We want this to be useful and interesting for you all so you can take the information here and go back to your schools, your communities, your churches, wherever you're going back to, and report it out and keep this conversation going through any number of forums that occur. So that's how we're going to go. Why don't we start really with the foundation here. We've got some math people on the panel and some science people on the panel. Can you, each of you, we'll start with Lynn right here. Can you just describe what these new standards are? What are they about? What's new? What's different? Where do they come from? Give us just a bit of that background, and then for each of you, take that same question and we'll go down the row so we get some foundational information about what these new standards really are all about.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics. They're new in several different ways. So first let me talk a little bit about the content of the standards. So they are descriptions of what kids should know and be able to do at every grade level from K through high school. High school, they're not organized by grade level, but what they should know and be able to do, say in geometry or algebra, etc. That's not new necessarily. We've had standards before, especially standards developed by the NCTM, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. But what is new is that these are fewer, they're more focused, they're definitely based on research on how children learn. So they proceed in a coherent way, both logically in mathematics and based on what we know about the cognitive development of children. And what's new is that they have been developed at the request of the National Governors Association and the Council on Chief State Officers, State School Officers. I can't remember the exact name, but Mike will be sure and tell us.
You got it right.
To be common across all the states. So, and most of the states have adopted these new standards. So there are consequences of that, which maybe we'll get into a little later. For me, the really exciting thing that's new and different from any preceding set of standards is that along with these content grade by grade level standards come a set of 8 standards of mathematical practice. And this is practices that children in their classrooms should be demonstrating. So I'm going to tell you a few of them. It gives me the chills even to think about, that this is our goal and hope. The first one, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. This is what mathematicians do. This is what we want all people to be able to do, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. The third one, create viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. So create arguments to justify your thinking. Model with mathematics. See structure in equations and use this structure to help you understand mathematics. They really emphasize understanding, and if children, if we can, it's a big challenge it will be a big challenge to teach so that children start to demonstrate these standards for mathematical practice, but it's such a goal, worthy goal that we want to achieve, and I think making mathematics, giving mathematical opportunities to all students in ways that it's going to be useful for them and that they are going to see the power of. So I think I'll stop there for the overview.
Mary, why don't you talk about the science standards?
Sure. I have been in science education for almost 20 years, and this is now my second set of standards that I'll be teaching from. So that in itself tells you that it's probably time to have some new standards for science education. The next generation science standards they're built in a very interesting way. They're built around cross-cutting concepts which make connections among different disciplines in science. There's an emphasis on engineering practices, and then of course there's content. The content, I would say, has been streamlined, and it's organized in a way that you can go back and see what students are doing in second grade that can eventually tie to what they're doing in seventh grade, to what they're doing in their high school years. There's opportunities through the engineering practices, which I value very deeply, for students to be real scientists. We're not looking up facts. We're not Googling information and memorizing it and filling in an option B on a multiple choice test. Ideally, we would be assessing our students using lab practicals, hands-on experiments, group projects. And so the new standards have really streamlined the content, identified content that's grade appropriate. I think much of the content is well connected to the math that corresponds with the student grade level. And then, again, most importantly, that there's a focus on engineering and doing scientists, behaving like a scientist, not just learning facts.
Okay, it's kind of interesting as I was listening even just to the how it all began and Common Core. I mean, we never really had a panel discussion when it came to the Illinois state standards, and for a lot of you that aren't familiar with those, they were vague. When we were teaching with the Illinois state standards, they weren't really all that clear. You could walk into a classroom and I could be teacher A and I could have teacher B in another classroom. We're supposed to be teaching the same standards, yet our classrooms would look completely different. And a lot of times it was left up to interpretations on how the teachers were looking at it. With the Common Core standards, there's clearer language. There's more of a building block between them. So just take fractions, for example. If you look at fractions starting in third grade, what the kids are doing in third grade lead to what they have to then do in fourth grade. Then it leads to what they have to do in fifth grade. Whereas under the old standards, you would look at a third grade textbook, a fourth grade textbook, fifth grade textbook, and they were doing almost exactly the same type of skills, just kind of masked in different ways. There wasn't really any kind of building upon skills, and so kids weren't getting a concept because there wasn't a level to really conceptually understand it. It was let's go through it, let's rush through it because spring break's about ready to come up, let's move on to another skill. We taught things in very kind of like disjunctive kind of ways. I mean, you'd have, commutative property was taught for 2 weeks, and then you'd move into associative property. Then you'd move into distributive property. And the kids never really understood, how do I really apply that concept to anything? How does it apply to algebra later when I get into become a freshman in high school? And what we're starting to see with the Common Core is there's a level for kids to dive deeper. There's a level of, I can now understand the concept because I've spent a little longer on it. And hopefully that then leads to not only, I mean, even like when we were listing the 8 math practices, if you had employees out there that were doing half of those, other things would start to happen in this country. And we attend to precision. For a long time, that was just let's just get the right answer. But are we using correct vocabulary? Not only from students, but teachers. And so the practices aren't just for the students, the practices, you know, are also holding the teachers to a higher level.
Okay, so we're going to go back and forth from math to science. I'm returning now to the science standards. And for me, you can really encapsulate what these standards are all about by thinking about involving students in figuring out something important about the world rather than just kind of passively learning about. And too much of our science in our country has been about kids learning all kinds of facts and definitions, and we've been talking a lot about application of the math, application of the science, not really working with the scientific ideas as tools to say, well, what in the world can this actually help me explain in my everyday life, things that I can experience? So for example, many of us, or some of us might remember from school that all matter, this table right here, this microphone, all matter is made of molecules, okay? So molecules are in the current Illinois standards, and they're in the next generation science standards. What's the difference? The difference is that we want kids to be able to say, wait, how do we know that this table's made of molecules? And like, what does that help me explain? What does that help me figure out about the world that I couldn't explain if I didn't have this concept? I don't just want to know the names and the definitions and the fact that molecules are made of atoms and so on. Like, what does the fact that the table, the solids, even liquids and gases are made of molecules, what does that help me make sense of about the world? And that's what the next generation science standards are all about. Involving kids not just in knowing the answers, but in getting to those answers, because the answers change. The science that we're learning today is drastically different than what we had 20 years ago because our society and the field of science has moved along. So working through the ideas and not just getting to the answers is what NGSS is all about, and that involves connecting to these practices that we're starting to talk about and these cross-cutting concepts.
So one of the things we hear a lot about is sort of questions or criticisms about how we as a state or we as a country compete with other nations. And there's this worry that it's Finland or the Chinese or Singapore or somewhere, and these the students are going to be smarter than ours, and they're going to be able to. I guess this little guy isn't working. This competitiveness issue, we hear it in the media quite often. So to that end, do these new standards, are they higher than the previous ones? Do they represent a greater level of expectation for our kids? And why or why not? And is that a good idea or not? Don't all jump at once. I'm happy to call names, but you however you'd like.
I can start.
Yeah, there you go.
I've been fortunate to work at Glenbrook North High School in Northbrook, and the science department there has offered students the opportunity for deep learning. We're on the 90-minute block schedule, so teachers have a large chunk of time to work with their students. Students have the chance to learn ways to use scientific tools and to think like a scientist, and then the teachers are all able to give them the opportunities to behave like scientists, manipulate variables, develop laboratory procedures, test their variables, figure out what is just not working all that well, tweaking, and then coming up with the best possible solution. And when we've been looking through the next generation standards, when they were adopted last spring, then we started really diving into the standards and taking a look at them. And really, knowing that so much of them are grounded in research, we're very fortunate because it's validating what we're already doing in our classroom. And so I don't necessarily look at the standards as higher standards for the high school that I'm at right now, But I think that it's definitely verifying that deeper learning is more meaningful.
Can I add to that? Stick with science for a minute. So I think it's an interesting way to phrase the question. There is a sense in which the standards are higher in that they are more demanding, and they will actually put us more in line with what our competing countries that score well on math and science actually demand of their students. So in a sense, they are more demanding. But they're also more achievable. What our research tells us is that involving kids, there are lots of kids in our system that are not successful in memorizing facts and definitions and in reading expository texts and getting all the information out of it. There are kids that really want to talk about the ideas and work through those ideas, and with that kind of support can learn these complex ideas, and that's what that deeper learning that you're talking about, that is what the next generation science standards are after. So yes, they are more demanding, but in a way, what our research tells us is that they should be able to hook more kids on science, to empower more kids to say, yeah, I can actually do this, because you know what? It really is common sense, in a way, working through all the ideas and seeing how they make sense and seeing what I can explain and seeing what fits the evidence. So yes, more demanding, but in a way, we have the chance to get more kids excited and succeeding about that science.
Thanks for shedding some light on that.
Yeah, but
How about math?
So I agree, this is kind of an interesting way to phrase it. It's clear that when the Common Core State Standards were developed in math, there was a lot of attention paid to some of the countries that achieved better on the international tests in math. But, you know, it's interesting because there are states in our country that achieve just as well as those high-achieving countries. So we have existence proofs here that our children can do just as well. So there's something else that's interfering. And what was interesting to me is that there were then some comparison studies of classrooms done in the high-achieving countries on the international tests, and many different countries. And we started to look at what's different. And one of the big things we noticed is, for various reasons in this country, we've evolved a curriculum, and you've probably heard this expression, a mile wide and an inch deep. I think part of this is because we have these state standards, very different standards in the different states, and textbook publishers would feel the need to include everything for every state. So pretty soon we have a very thin curriculum, and students don't learn very well, and as we heard, as Kurt said, teachers aren't consistently knowing how to choose what to focus on. So I think that the comparison, I wouldn't think of it as so much as competition, but we see that where kids are successful and where they are here, and we can learn from that experience.
Well, I think we have to kind of raise the standards because we no longer have a remedial math program when kids walk into high school as freshmen. They're automatically thrown into an Algebra 1 class and expected to, like, okay, you better get this concept, otherwise you're gonna, fail, and a lot of them do. And because oftentimes they weren't prepared with their past, because they didn't understand it. And it wasn't, because it was just rote memorization for a lot of them. It's like plug some numbers into the quadratic equation, plug some numbers into the Pythagorean theorem, and hope that you can maybe do well on the test. Now it's like actually diving into a concept, understanding that concept, figuring out how to apply that concept to other areas. And oftentimes becoming like early engineers in a lot of ways. And that's really kind of what the expectation is to get kids to conceptually understand not only what they're doing, but what their peers are doing. Look at what so-and-so in the classroom, how they solved a problem, and being able to understand how their method was different than your method. And that understanding gets kids not only talking, but it gets kids deeper into the topic, because they're now able to just go to their classmate and say, hey, I get this concept. I can now explain it to you because, and so I think we're starting to see that. So I don't necessarily think it's higher in the fact that it's unattainable goals. I think it's higher in the fact that the expectations have to be higher just in order for us to succeed.
It seems that another thing that's new about these standards is that they're not just for Illinois. The previous set of standards was written by educators and people in Illinois maybe 15 years ago, but these were developed very differently. As I understand it, the next generation science standards was written by a big committee of lots of state level people in response to a framework that a set of scientists put together. And the mathematics standards, as Lynn, as you mentioned, was driven by the Governor's Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. What does it mean for Illinois that these standards are common? Is that going to help us, or is that going to hurt? What do we do, given that what we're doing here is the same now as what happens in Iowa and Indiana?
Well, I think I just alluded to this. For one thing, the textbooks can be much better because they don't have to focus on 50 different, I don't have to include material from 50 different states. They can focus really on helping students to learn these Common Core state standards. Also, professional development for teachers can have a similar focus. That is, we can agree. There's mobility for teachers, there's mobility for students, but we have if students come to Illinois now, we pretty much can assume that they're about the same place as our students. So I think all of this is helpful for us. It's very helpful now, too, that new resources are being created to help produce the classroom that Kurt was describing. And these resources can be shared nationally, internationally. We just have a lot more access to ways to make this happen that we can share. So those are just a few consequences for our teachers and our students.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of science, we would say a very similar story. There was a consortium of 26 states that worked together to create the next generation science standards. And what we gain in Illinois by being a part of the consortium that created them and a part of currently there are 12 states and the District of Columbia that have adopted NGSS, is we all don't have to reinvent the wheel in parallel, okay? We can learn from what each other is doing in terms of putting this research into practice to bring some really innovative and in some ways kind of big changes into classrooms in order to achieve what the next generation science standards are targeting. And again, pointing to the sort of international competition, the Asian countries and some of the European countries that outperform us in math and science, one of the things that is an obstacle for us is we really have 50 different or even more school systems that are inventing standards, inventing assessments, inventing ways of doing business in parallel. Let's figure out what works and let's try and do that. There's plenty of room for local adaptation and local tailoring. The standards are not curriculum. And so the examples we use in Illinois could be from Lake Michigan if we decide to do that for a science context or a mathematics context. The standards are what every kid should be able to learn how to do and know about. And the specific ways that we get there can be local to Illinois or to Washington, D.C. or Vermont or wherever. And so to get the best of both worlds of the local tailoring and working with our partners elsewhere in the country, I think this kind of alignment for both math and science has a lot of promise.
I think one of the pieces that teachers appreciate the most about going to a conference is the informal conversations that they have with other professionals. And just as you were saying about 50 little mini countries, if we all pull together and work together, and it is just that much more collaborative and we're working as a unit. I think of one example that stands out in my mind. Our environmental science class, for example, was working on, they were working on a humidity, they were working on reading graphs about humidity in different biomes, and they were able to tap into a school in Arizona and exchange data. And technology has brought classrooms together from all over the country, and so why not share standards and work together, students and teachers?
Let me push a little bit on what's really different here. Because, you know, the old math standards, they talked about problem solving. You know, when we were all in school, we had word problems to do. The old science standards, they had a lot of experiments in them, and we talked about this thing called inquiry that was really, really important. But even with those old standards, you know, half the kids in Illinois weren't meeting the standards. If you look at any number of tests, of course that varies sort of by district and whatnot, but there's a large amount of kids who weren't meeting the proficiency levels. How's it going to be different this time? And why do these new standards give us a greater sense of possibility?
Well, so problem solving, I don't know. I mean, I have a few years on most of the other people in this panel, but we were never taught problem solving. We were given problems to do. And some people could do them, and they progressed, and some people couldn't, and they dropped out, and it seemed to be kind of the model that was okay. Because after all, I'm not a math person, right? My mother wasn't a math person, my sister wasn't a math person, I'm not a math person, so it's okay. But it's not okay because most of life is problem solving in one sense or another, and the usefulness of mathematics is to take a problem, is to take a situation and mathematize it and use some strategies that you've learned and produce something that's useful. So the only way we're going to be able to have students be successful in that is if we spend the time that it takes to have them work on non-routine problems. So spend a half hour working on a non-routine problem that has maybe just 4 parts. And maybe the first part is maybe it's a 6th grade problem, but the first part is a 4th grade level. But then the second 2 parts are at grade level, but they're challenging, they're pushing me a little, but this is what I'm supposed to be doing in 6th grade. And maybe the last part is a real challenge, so it pushes me beyond that, and maybe I'm not going to get that, not the first few times. But I'm going to start to learn about this perseverance and how that pays off. Now, the question of the proficiency means we're talking about tests, and we've avoided talking about tests so far. But what we really need if we want these standards to be successful is we need assessments that will assess what we think is important, so these mathematical practices. So if the assessments also have non-routine problems, but I'm giving my students non-routine problems as a matter of course, fewer, you know, a half hour working on one problem rather than a worksheet that has 30 problems that they should be able to do each one in 1 minute. They're going to be successful on the tests. I think that we have to believe that.
So if I can jump in for science, I mean, your question is essentially, are we really trying to do something different? We talked about doing experiments and doing science in the standards in the 1990s, and if only half of our kids, plus or minus, could succeed, then, you know, why are we changing things now, and what will happen? I guess what I would point to is that we've had 20 years of research about what has worked and what has worked less well, and a chance to learn from some of the successful practices that are out there in classrooms. And while it's certainly true that the new science standards build on the successes and the spirit of what we were trying to do in the standards in the 1990s, we now know how to do that more effectively and how to help kids achieve that we're not achieving with the old standards. And so you talked about inquiry. In a way, the practices are a re-envisioning of science inquiry and trying to spell out in more detail, how do you help every single kid engage in the sense making that is part of science practices. How do you help kids create science arguments with evidence to make sense of data? So I think what we're doing is not throwing out the old standards and saying, oh, okay, it's 20 years, we have a different idea now. It's we've learned a lot, let's revisit what we were trying to do 20 years ago with the best research that's out there, the best technology that's out there. We know how we can do a better job and help more kids succeed, and that's what these science practices of trying to make more explicit, how do you engage in argumentation? How do you engage in critique? How do you engage in taking a science idea, which could be very abstract, and fitting it to what you can see all around you in Lake Michigan or in your local ecosystem or in your classroom as you're dropping things and watching gravity act on them? And that's really what the next step of the next generation science standards is all about.
Well, I mean, some of it, it goes to, when we're thinking about, oh, well, why change? We look at, some of the things weren't working. So we have to kind of also think about, well, how can we build upon it? But case example, I was with my classroom. I was working at a 6th grade level, and teaching mean, medium, and mode 5 years ago was just memorizing mean, medium, and mode. Memorize the formula, take your set of data, add them up, divide by a certain number, and that's how we were teaching it. But now with the new standards, it's kind of more understanding that they're just different ways to represent data. There are ways to talk about central tendencies. When am I going to use mean over mode? When am I going to use these different tools in order to describe the same set of data? And now kids are able to, I watched students that were low readers come in and had a hard time with the old way of having to sit there and line up their set of data, add up the numbers, go through this whole formula routine, to, hey, I'm starting to get this. I can line up, if I had, we used an example in the 6th grade classroom. If we had Shaq come to class one day, and we were doing average height of a 6th grade student, what's going to happen to our average if we're going just solely on mean? Well, our average is going to be skewed, because all of a sudden we got Shaq standing in the room, and he's not an average 6th grade, height. And the kids are going, wow, I kind of get that. And then all of a sudden now they're talking about outliers for the first time ever. They're understanding how if we drop that set of data, all of a sudden by figuring out the median and who's the kid standing in the middle row and we're lining them up by height and going, oh, he's the average. And so now Shaq doesn't play a role into the picture, and the kids were all of a sudden getting the concept for the first time. I think that's really where it boils down to is, yes, we had these concepts, and we're not really reinventing the wheel. We're just figuring out other ways to approach the same kind of concept so that kids, hopefully that light bulb's going off and they're going, hey, I get this for the first time ever. Because I think for the longest time, especially with math, we're selling this program to half the people that don't want it. Because they're sitting there going, I don't get math, I don't understand math. What's the purpose? Even teaching upper grades, I had kids that said, well, why should I even learn math? When am I ever going to use this? And I think even going back to the 8 math practices, when are you not going to have to attend to precision? When are you not going to have to work through a problem until you're complete, actually to completion? Those are things that we're always going to have to do, so.
But kids in Common Core still have to know how to calculate the average, right?
Yeah.
All right, good. That's helpful. Let's talk a little bit about classrooms. So, Kurt, this is for you and Mary first, and then we'll let Brian and Lynn sort of chime in. When you walk into a teacher's classroom that's using the Common Core state standards or the next generation science standards, what do you want it to look like? What do you not want to see? Describe that, what it should look and feel like to someone who may not have been in a classroom for a while.
I'll just jump on that really quick. One of the things is math talks. It's one of the kind of the new buzzwords, but it's actually getting, so it's basically the teacher's not just putting up some random problem for the kids to solve, and it's always a quick little type routine, but it's actually thinking through kind of what do I want kids to conceptually understand. So I might start off with, even with an 8th grade classroom, putting up 9 times 2. How many of you get it? Put a thumb up if you can get it. Can you come up with another way of doing it? Put a second finger. And all of a sudden what you're starting to see is by allowing kids to put up more fingers for other strategies of solving that problem, the high kid's now able to sit there and do 3, 4 fingers. The low kid might only have 1 finger, but they're putting the finger up against their chest so that nobody else in the classroom needs to be aware of who has the right answer, who doesn't, because the old classroom was Johnny always suddenly raised his hand and Johnny always knew the answer. Every single other kid in the class is sitting there either hating Johnny or they're putting their hand back down because they don't want to answer it. And now we're starting to see conversations and dialogues in the classroom. And that's really where the teacher's role has changed of being more the facilitator, figuring out how can I get the kids to talk about a concept, how can I walk around the room and help engage them and not just stand up in front of the classroom and be sort of this, and everybody else is passive observers hoping that they somehow absorb it like a sponge. They're actually actively involved in the learning.
My role at Glenbrook North is to, I teach 1 class of biology, and then my primary role is to observe teachers. I observe, take notes, collect data, we meet and discuss classrooms. And so I am fortunate to be in and out of, I don't know, probably 60, 70 classrooms in a given school year. I pop in for 15 minutes here and there. I stay for the full 90 minutes as well. And so I get to see what's going on in all kinds of classrooms, and then I steal all kinds of ideas for my own room and try to make it work with my students. And that is definitely my most favorite part of my job because I can see the magic happening. And I alluded to it earlier, we're on a 90-minute block. Teachers have a lot of time to allow for a little bits of direct instruction and then letting students problem solve together and present and teach their peers. Critique their peers. Oftentimes, students will use whiteboards, like 2-foot by 3-foot whiteboards, to explain a problem in physics, and they explain it to their peers. The teacher will simply say, do we have any questions for our presenters? And student hands will go up. The student presenters will call on them. So it's students teaching students, it's students learning from other students, it's dialogue. One of the benefits of the next generation science standards is that they're all tied to the Common Core Math and the Common Core ELA. And they're set up where they're kind of 1-page documents, and so it's very easy to see what math ties to the science that we're teaching, what ELA skills might tie. In my biology class, we always try to think of creative ways to remember all the phases of mitosis, and that's wonderful if you know metaphase comes before anaphase, but it really doesn't mean much if you don't know why. And so instead of just teaching the phases, we give them pictures of the phases, and the kids have to organize the pictures in a logical order and describe what they think is happening. And I really don't mind if they don't know what phase is truly metaphase, as long as they know why metaphase is there. And so in the old Illinois state standards, one of the standards that applied to mitosis was understand cellular processes. And if you're a biology teacher, you know there's all kinds of cellular processes. So whatever those processes may be, it's kind of hard to determine which has one teacher interpreting it one way and another teacher interpreting another way. But now in the new standards, they tell you, make sure kids understand the process of mitosis, and then it says right on there, don't worry about having them memorizing the names of the phases. And so I think that example really drives home that it's about understanding the why, being able to explain rather than just being able to tell. And I think that makes a huge difference in the classroom.
Just to pick up on that, I think one thing that you probably will see that may look different to you if you went to school when some of us went to school is a lot of, in a science classroom, a lot of conversation. And you mentioned sort of kids teaching each other, not just teaching each other like, okay, I got this all figured out and, you know, let me clue you into it, but let's talk this through and see if we can figure this out together. Or let's see if you can poke a hole in my argument, because maybe you have some different evidence that I didn't look at, and I have some different evidence that you didn't look at. And when we put our ideas together, we'll actually negotiate an even better third idea, right? So you'll see a lot more conversation, because what we know is that for a lot of folks, working through an idea, especially things like science ideas that are pretty complicated, like how does one cell turn into two cells? I mean, that sounds pretty cool, right? But, and I don't want to just know the name of the different pieces. I want to know, like, how does it actually do that? And how does it know to duplicate all the right stuff so that we end up with two cells that have all the right things in them? So a lot of conversation to get to some understanding. And I think one diagnostic of that is you should be able to walk over to any group of kids and say, what are you working on? And the answer shouldn't be chapter 2, okay? The answer should be, we're trying to figure out how in the world you get like 2 nuclei and enough of all the stuff so that, you know, a cell can duplicate. And where did all the stuff come from that allowed it to do that? I mean, there should be some thing in the world that we're trying to explain. And there's a very different answer to, like, why do I need to know this? The answer, why do I need to know this, is because I'm trying to figure out, you know, my kid brother used to be this tall, and then he got to be like this tall. Where did all that stuff come from? And how did all that muscle and bone and whatever, like, he didn't eat muscle and bone, he ate hamburgers. Like, how did that turn into what he grew into? So there's some phenomenon that we're trying to explain. I don't care that it was chapter 2, right?
What about talking about parents in this space? What, I mean, you've all commented how these standards are different, and you all more or less agreed that these were higher in some ways. So that means like homework's going to look different, right? So what should parents do, given that we have these new standards? What should they expect?
I can start. I would say because the learning is taking place in a different way in the classroom, homework is going to look a little bit different. I like to think that my classroom is a very important place for students to be. When students are absent and they say, what did I miss? I can't possibly duplicate what they missed. I can tell them what we did, but they missed out on so much of the collaborative problem solving and the discussion and the student presentations, and those are things that you just can't replicate for students who are absent. So I would say attendance is a very important thing. It always has been, but I would say more so now because the learning experiences are quite difficult to duplicate. As far as homework goes, I think instead of having students do 30 practice problems, you know, in a genetics unit, for example, they might do 1 or 2 practice problems, and then they might research, you know, a dominant trait that is found in their family, or you know, they might have a writing assignment to do in science rather than just reading out of the textbooks. A lot of times we'll assign YouTube videos and have them react to that. You know, take notes on the video or relate it to what we're doing in class. There's so many things in science that you just can't replicate in the classroom, but YouTube videos do a really nice job of using simulations, and so a lot of times students will be assigned a video to watch at home as well. So I think homework is looking a little bit different. I know it has at my school for years now, and you know, like I said, the new standards are just validating all of the wonderful things the teachers are doing in the classroom.
Okay, I think one of the things that parents are going to see less of is worksheets. It's, you know, I mean, where your student maybe years ago might have come home with, you know, the 10 problems that were just multiple choice, or, you know, oh, I got to do my multiplication table and work on that, and that might have just been their night's homework. Whereas now, instead of doing, say, area of a rectangle, and it's, you know, 4 times 3 on the sides, the problem may be just worded where draw as many rectangles as you can that have the area of 48 square feet. And students are now having to apply the concept of still area, but now they're coming up with seeing that there's more than one that's going to give them that same area. And so they're taking the concept a little further. I mean, I think one of the biggest misconceptions I've heard is there's now more steps for some reason with math. Oh, my kid is having to do like 15 steps in order to solve the problem. No, you're still doing 5 times 4 the same way as you were doing 5 times 4 20 years ago. There might be now new algorithms and new procedures and stuff that they're learning, and that's more so that if someone is doing skip counting with a number line, or they're doing tape measure or a double number line or some other picture, they're able to explain that because they've done some themselves. So there may be some new forms of solving a problem that might show up, but it's not necessarily say, hey, this is your kid now has to learn how to do math this way. It's to sort of expose them to different ways that other people think, and to say, hey, there's other methods for me to get there. And my method is not necessarily wrong, it's just there's different ways.
I think to go back to the science, what you'll see is less homework that involves reading the chapter and taking notes, or filling in, as you said, worksheets, filling in worksheets with a fill in the blank kind of thing, and more work at home that is actually work toward learning, which would be things like writing out an argument, or analyzing data, or maybe critiquing an argument that kind of summarizes something that you worked on in class. And it may be, it can be somewhat intimidating, I know, as a parent, to help your kids with, who are learning science or math in a way that has shifted a bit from the way that we learned it when we were in school. But the good thing about at least the science is that there's sort of a set of things that you should be able to ask your child without knowing the answers. You should be able to ask them, so like, what are you trying to figure out now? And how far have you gotten? And what part are you still working on? What part are you still trying to figure out? And although as a parent of a teenager, I know talking to teenagers is not always the easiest thing in the world, one should be able to ask your kid that question. And if they are learning in an NGSS classroom, they should be able to say, you know, we're trying to figure out like how the human body, like how do I get the energy that I need to do the stuff that I do? And I thought at first that sleep was really important, but I discovered that while we're sleeping, our body is actually using energy. And we know that because of those blood glucose level graphs that we were looking at. And so we're trying to figure out what is happening to turn the food into energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, that might be the best thing you can do to sort of prod your kid along. And actually, you'll be surprised how enthused they can be about the stuff that they're trying to figure out when science is about figuring out rather than learning all kinds of facts and definitions.
I was going to say something a little similar. I mean, I've mentioned several times the first standard for mathematical practice is make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. So, yes, so homework will look different, probably, and there might be problems that a child will bring home that they can't complete. So some of it, I think, is how you react to that. one of the things we're incorporating in our professional development is the research that's done on a kind of mindset. I referred to this earlier. We're not born being able to do calculus or not. We learn by effort. So encouraging, I think parents can encourage children by asking them, well, what is it, what are you thinking about the problem, and what have you tried to do, and encourage them that it's okay not always to be able to finish, that you can put it aside for a while and think about it again tomorrow. I mean, it depends, of course, on what the teacher's expectation is. I think that would be another thing to do, would be to, if you think that the homework looks really different and you kind of don't understand what's going on, is to talk to the teacher and better understand the teacher's goals for whatever work is being done at home. But I think definitely encouraging kids that effort and continuing to work pays off. That's how we all learn. Even there's research that shows making mistakes is when you learn. That's correcting mistakes, failing sometimes and correcting that. That's when the real learning occurs. So it takes a change in our own mindsets to be okay with that. But everything will take some time.
What about your questions? What do you want to ask this panel? I'm sure they'll help with homework, if you brought any.
Testing. How are we measuring this? I know they're looking at the PART test, but that doesn't seem to be going over very well in the United States in general. Why are a lot of states opting out of it? And my understanding is it's only testing math and reading, that it doesn't have a strong science component. Is that true?
Do you want to take? Well, okay. So the Common Core standards in math and literacy were developed first. They were developed, as we said, by request of the Governors Association, etc. And so when they were developed, there were also two consortia formed for developing assessments of both literacy and math. So this was done before the next generation science standards had reached a stage even closely ready for talking about assessment. So I think that maybe answers your second question. The question about, so Illinois is a park, we're a member of the Park Consortium, and I think originally about 26 states were, and some have dropped out. I don't know if I would say it's a lot. I think it's still very much, we don't know very much yet about them. There are now sample practice tests out there. I think the questions people agree are good. They are testing the practices. They're, not your ISAT multiple choice questions. One thing that people are concerned about is the format, because they will be taken, the end of course exams will be taken on the computer. So I think this is still open to discussion. It's still open to formation. Maybe they won't get it right in the beginning, but I think we have time to work on it. The whole question of how much testing we do is another question, though. I mean, I think that moving to a good assessment of the Common Core is one thing, but we need to leave behind all the other testing that we do when we do that. That's my own personal opinion.
Oh, I mean, because I've actually looked at some of the park sample questions, and there is a level of difficulty there. And I think that's also why you see states going, hey, wait a second, I don't know if I want to do this or not. But at the same time, it's causing kids to, again, do exactly what they were doing in the classroom, having to think, having to reason through, not just, oh, I'm going to pick an answer. Sometimes there's, for example, they may have to list as many different equivalent fractions as they can. And they get credit for as many different ones that they can kind of think of within a period. That's one example that I saw. Other times they have to kind of reason through a list of problems that are there and say which ones are true, which ones are false, and they have to kind of work through each one of them. A sample 8th grade question on the park is for them looking at they have a company and they have to look at a data table, they have to look at a graph, and they have to look at an equation. And they have to determine which company would be a better company to go with, I think for like a cell phone plan or some other rate of increase. And so they're not only having to understand what does that constant rate look like in an equation, what does that constant rate look like in a graph, what does that constant rate look like in a table. So there's more level of thought there. And so, yeah, I think because it hasn't been fully revealed either, I think that's why there's some concern out there.
Let me just chime in a bit on that, since I know a thing or two about these, though probably not everything. Both of the assessment consortia will be more expensive to states than their previous assessment because they are sort of measuring these more complicated skills. It costs more money per student to do that. There have been several states that have opted out of the consortia for those reasons. Because the standards are, again, generally accepted to be higher, the anticipation is that the proportion of students in a state that meet the standards will be lower because the standards have raised. And that is a big political lift for many folks. We should expect in Illinois that the number of students, the proportion of students who are meeting standards is lower in the PARCC test because they are measuring things to a higher standard. And that is going to be frustrating for many. And there have been states that have pulled out for those reasons.
So science is at a very different point, and as you said, I mean, it's not a deficiency of the PARCC test that it doesn't have science. It wasn't designed to assess science. It was designed to assess math and language arts. And so with the next generation science standards having been just released, there are now some recommendations for what the assessments should look like. And that is all very much still a work in progress. Frankly, most states are so focused on implementing Common Core in math and language arts and the assessment system for that, they're happy that science implementation is a year or two, behind that. One thing I wanted to point out is that we tend to talk about assessments and equate that with large-scale state tests. There are lots of different purposes of assessment. There are lots of different kinds of assessments, and we need to be careful not to only pay attention to these large-scale state tests. One role of assessment is to identify how an individual student is doing and figure out where that student should go next. Another level is the teacher's assessment of the students to figure out what to do tomorrow in instruction. We may want to evaluate districts. We may want to evaluate individual schools. These are all different goals for assessment, and they need different kinds of instruments. But the bottom line for NGSS is that if we're actually looking at kids engaging in the practices in order to make sense of and use the science ideas, then the kind of test questions will look very different. You won't be asked to name the parts of the cell. You won't be asked to name the phases of mitosis, okay? You'll be asked to write a paragraph about why we have cells, or what problem does mitosis solve, and how do we know that it happens, or something of that sort. So those will be more labor-intensive to grade for teachers, right? And more labor-intensive for states who are using those kind of questions on the state assessments. But right now, Illinois has not released what the policy will be for state science assessment, so this is all very much right now in the works. I think the thinking of a lot of folks in the state is let's figure out how to help teachers understand how to teach with NGSS. Let's help our community understand what's coming. And the state assessment system needs to be developed in parallel, but we're not going to wait to get started since we already know what NGSS should and could look like in individual classrooms.
Other questions?
One quick note, if anyone wants to make your question louder, I'll do the microphone over here. And secondly, if anyone has a question that pertains directly to the Skokie schools, we have a representative that's one of those right in the audience, and so we can help with those questions.
The devil is usually in the details, so my question is two-pronged. One is if proficiency is what we are testing, and we only require in Illinois 2 years of science. We have full curricula, 4, 5, 6 years of science, environmental science, biological, chemical engineering, etc. How do we do that? And the second part is, if NGSS is supposed to start in kindergarten, and the assessments are, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 years, then at the high school level, how do we phase it in, and is it even meaningful?
I can speak to that. There was a bill proposed, you can't quote me on the date, but it was, I believe, in the spring to increase the science requirement for graduation in Illinois to 3 years. I don't know if it has much momentum, but I would assume that because the theme of the Next Generation standards are all standards, all students, that, that at some point we would have to increase that requirement for graduation. At the school that I happen to be at, we have probably very close to 100% taking 4 years, and a large number of students doubling up, taking 5 or 6 years of science even. So for me personally, that hasn't been much of a concern, so I haven't been watching over that. And then I forgot the other part of your question, I'm sorry.
Phasing in.
Oh, phasing in. That, you know, that's something that I would say, if I had to speak to a criticism of the standards, and we were talking to this just prior to the panel, it's really, I have a 3rd grader, a 5th grader, and a 7th grader at home. And my 3rd grader was doing tape diagrams in math, which she can explain division instead of just saying 18 divided by 6 is 3, she can explain why it's 3. So what they're doing is working. But my 7th grader looks at her sheet and says, what is she doing? So he just, you know, he says the answer is 3. Why isn't she just writing 3? So I think one of the problems with new standards is we start the new standards. And students are starting in kindergarten, and so if we're teaching high school juniors to the standards, where we can't assume that they had the standards K through sophomore year. And so I think teachers will be very, very sensitive to that and think of a somewhat hybrid model over the next several years as we transition into full-blown standards. But by that time, then, the standards will be 12 years old. So that's probably the puzzle that we'll always have in education. Mm-hmm.
I guess starting with the phase-in first, you're absolutely right. Particularly since an issue that is first and foremost in NGSS is this idea of coherence, of building very carefully, helping kids build very carefully new ideas that they're learning on what we figured out last month, last year, even several years ago. And what is in some cases sort of challenging at the high school level. You mean like the biology stuff we're learning should connect to the chemistry stuff we're learning? Well, it turns out that living things are actually made of matter and subject to the same rules about the physical universe that you know, trucks going down a ramp are subject to. And so, yeah, so phasing in is quite challenging. And so we've been doing a lot of work, and folks around the country have been doing a lot of work with teachers to help them figure out, okay, ideally, if you're a 12th grade teacher, you would probably wait 11 years to phase in NGSS, but obviously that's not what we want to do, especially since we know these are better ways to learn, and so why disadvantage today's 12th graders, right? So, you know, what can we do now, not having had a kid who's come up through K through whatever with NGSS? And there are things that we can do. Integrating the practices is one thing that is a really good starting place for teachers. So you see, for example, middle school teachers taking what in NGSS is, say, 5th grade learning goals and making them the focus of what they're doing in middle school, because today's entering sixth graders have not had NGSS K through 5. One thing that we desperately need to do in phasing in NGSS is to address the time problems that have arisen in the last decade with the time that's been allocated for science. There are all kinds of reasons for this, but the average time dedicated to the teaching of science in elementary grades has dropped dramatically in the era of No Child Left Behind as more and more time has been given over to math and language arts. There's no way that we're going to be able to meet the next generation science standards if we don't give adequate time to science in the elementary grades, and that's one of the things that structurally will need to change in order to meet NGSS. The question of the number of years of science required by the state or by the district or by the school is an interesting question, but it's not unique to NGSS. It would be impossible to meet the current Illinois high school state science standards with 2 years. I mean, there's no way one could meet those standards with 2 years of science. So I'm not sure that we're raising the bar substantially with NGSS. It's just another chance to raise this question of, if we're only requiring 2 years, but we say kids should know X, Y, and Z, and you put all those together, like how does that really go together?
What other questions? Yeah, right here.
The STEM subject obviously is important, but I'm wondering when they're trying to standardize the teaching of computer science language, for example, like C, Python. I believe those languages would be important from near future, but I'm wondering, are they teaching subject or the option? Take those kinds of things.
I didn't hear the question.
The question was, at least as I heard the question, what about the teaching of computer science and programming languages, and how does that fit in?
Okay,
Shouldn't
that's
that be
what I thought
part of all this?
Well, it's an interesting question, and you phrased it, you said Illinois, and of course we're talking about national standards here. I don't believe right now there's been a movement for kind of national standards in computer science, nor at the state level, but I think there's a lot of discussion about integrating. I mean, I just hear a lot of talk about kids learning more computational thinking earlier, and there is some reference to computational thinking in the NGSS, but it's not directly linked, I don't think, to computer science. Is that right?
So I can clarify that. I mean, I think one of the practices that is involved in NGSS is mathematical and computational thinking. And that may be achieved in part by learning to use a programming language and address it, and use it to address some scientific problems. But it's not necessarily just learning Java for its own sake. It would be working with some computational modeling environment. Maybe you're going all the way down to Java, or maybe it's a simulation environment and you're playing around with different parameters. The computational environment is a tool to learn the science in the way that it is in NGSS. You're right that there's an open question in our country about what's the role of computer science education. It's not a question that was solved by either the Common Core or NGSS. And it's a question that is a bigger question than those standards. Where does the teaching of computer science fall in our K-12 school system? NGSS did not say, let's reorganize all of our high schools and move where computer science education happens and make it part of the science department. One could argue it should have, right? But that's not what we did.
I'm just curious, is the PARCC test going to be a timed test for kids? Now they have to explain all these answers. How are they going to handle the children answering? I mean, I hope they're not. Yeah, now they have to learn the computer keyboard to try and type their answers. And then on top of it, do they have anxiety about, oh my gosh, I have 5 minutes to answer
I have a little bit of information. It's information that was shared with me through my administration meetings. Oh, sure. How are they going to handle the timing of the park test? Because it's computer, so the kids will have to keyboard as well as have the anxiety of actually taking a test. We're in the preliminary stages of figuring out the timing of the different tests at the high school level. And I'm not math, I'm science. So it sounds like the test is like an end of course test. And so if you're an Algebra 2 student, if you were a sophomore, junior, or a senior or freshman in Algebra 2, you would take that test when you take your Algebra 2. So it's not a blanket test for all juniors like the Prairie State test was. It also sounds like the accommodations for extended time will change. It's my understanding, and please don't quote me, even though I'm being quoted, that if the test is, let's say, a 45-minute test, the students are given 70 minutes to complete the test. Or the timing is exaggerated for all students. And I think it's exaggerated to meet that, that extra time requirement for so many students and for the technology piece and things of that nature. Now, after the first year that they run the park test, maybe that will change. I don't know. I mean, we're all still in the learning phases because we haven't done that. But that was information that was communicated to me through a meeting at school. So I'm not exact, but I'll give you some idea.
I heard at one point that they won't be timed, which seemed to me impossible, but I can see that the solution like that you're suggesting might be one way to, in essence, try and build in not having it be timed, not having time be a factor. There were a number of CPS schools last year that piloted Park, and I talked to a number of teachers that gave it in their schools, and I didn't hear that concern at all. So I think it must be, as you suggested, that they're trying to make sure that's not a factor.
Yeah, I think they're still working out some of the formatting, because I've also heard through the grapevine that there's even possibly 2 parts to the test, because there's been some concerns on the open response type of question on how effective it's going to be on an online environment, if a kid's going to have to use multiple models or have to maybe do different drawing diagrams or whatever to solve it. So there's been talk that there's going to be a print component as well as the online component, possibly just for the more of the open response type of question. And those would probably be given at different times in the year.
Any more questions?
I was just curious to the panel's assessment of where publishing houses are at in their modification of the instructional materials to either the Common Core or the Next Generation.
Well, I guess I could take this one now that I'm actually working at one of the publishing houses. But I mean, one of the things is like this is, I think, one of the struggles that teachers saw even last year and even the year before, is a lot of the material that was coming out was had this sort of Band-Aid put on it saying, hey, we're Common Core. And they really hadn't done the research or gone through some of their problems to really look at how much they actually fit the Common Core standards. They were just sort of slapping the standards on. And I know that especially the stuff that's coming out this year and even next year, publishers have really, I mean, they've dug in a little deeper. I mean, the last couple of years, I think it was a little harder just because it was still fairly new. Schools were still, I mean, even the implementation here in Chicago, we were rolling it out at the upper grade levels first, but it was only in the springtime, and then the K through K through 6 kind of rolled it out the following year. And so a lot of the publishing companies are kind of catching up behind because of that. But again, going back to even what we had brought out earlier of one of the beauties of it being common is there's so many now online communities, online resources where teachers are sharing lessons that they've done in their classrooms, ways that they've implemented it. And there has been a little bit of a shift from just always relying on just a textbook, because oftentimes, you know, the textbooks, you know, are great, but at the same time, you know, it's like, are they really allowing kids to go deep into a concept? So yeah, there has been a shift, and I think you'll see it more in probably the stuff coming out in 2015.
Other questions?
Can I just jump in on science, because the answer is a little different, or maybe I'm just less optimistic. I think we need to be very cautious in looking at anything that the publishers come out with in the near term, because there is a tendency for at least science textbook publishers to do a sort of Band-Aid approach. And I think that one of the things that is a real emphasis in NGSS is the integration of the doing of science with the science ideas. And it's very difficult to imagine a traditional textbook where kids are reading and taking notes and answering end of chapter questions as really satisfying the goals of NGSS. So I think the role of teachers in working together across the state and with teachers in other states to develop materials that engage kids in the practices is going to turn out to be very key. ISB, the Illinois State Board of Education, has organized a group of 40 teachers. I'm privileged to work with those teachers. We are developing materials that will exemplify what does it really look like at the classroom level when you're helping kids build science models and engaging in argumentation with primary evidence, primary source data. And it's a very laborious process, but having some examples out there I think will help our broad community of teachers work with these ideas and see what it really looks like in practice. But it will be we're in transition now, and it will be a process.
Other questions?
A number of you have alluded to the greater demand for students to articulate ideas in the form of math talks and problem solve and critique ideas and write arguments. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about what challenges we face in supporting English language learners, and that includes even students who are English speakers but need greater academic language development. What do you think are the challenges teachers face there, or the outlays in teaching, and how do we solve those issues to support language development, which is now required at these higher levels of cognitive practice?
I can talk to that. We have a very small ELL population at our school, and so it's easy to work directly with that small group of students. We have probably, I think we have about 14, we have a school of about 2,100, 2,000, and we have, I think, 14 students in our ELL Earth Science class. So it's a very small population. We have a teacher and an ELL aide in the classroom, and when we recently, we recently designed an ELL Earth Science class. So we have a biology class and an Earth Science class that we alternate years. And we do that because neither one of the classes are math dependent. And so whenever the student comes in, independent of their math ability, they can take 2 years of English supported courses and get the 2-year graduation requirement, but then ideally move on to chemistry and physics their junior and senior year. We also chose earth science and biology because they tend to be the most language-heavy science courses, whereas chemistry and physics, you know, they tie directly to math, but the reading wouldn't be as intense and the vocabulary wouldn't be as intense. one of the things that we did is we took a really close look at the WIDA standards, and those are the standards for the ELL students. We used those WIDA standards when we developed individual lesson plans for the class. And we have lots of strategies built in that intermingle the use of academic language and conversational language. So many of our ELL students, when you talk to them in conversation, you feel like they've been speaking English since birth, like so many of us, and you take that academic language for granted. And so I believe that we've done a really nice job marrying the academic language with the conversational language and embedding the WIDA standards with the next generation standards. And then the other piece that ties in very well is the ELA, the Common Core ELA standards that are also tied to the next generation standards. They allow us to pluck out those skills to make sure that we're incorporating all those skills along the way.
A few more questions. I think I saw hands. I think we may have time to get to one or two more.
I can extend a little bit, given or working in this area where there are ELL populations. For example, in 219, we speak, our students and families speak over 9 different languages. And when you get to elementary K-8, it's over 70 different languages. But what is amazing is with the programming that we have, within a short number of years, those students get support early on. We have so many students with language needs that they get that support in the classroom. Within a couple of years, they're ready to go and have these rich conversations that you described with their peers. And so it's amazing how fast they can grasp that language and really become an integral part of the fabric of those conversations. So they do grow very, very quickly. A comment to the gentleman on computer science. I know as a district we can be proud of this community. I actually left a program we were doing for coding for children in grades K1 and 2. They were actually there doing playing robot turtles, and we had 100 students, K1 and 2, starting at the age of 5, all with their parents, and it's a 6-part series. And so they're going to start there. Much of our coding will then take place through robotics. We'll move them on to an MIT program with Scratch, and then Vex robotics, and then do some other things with probably Reiser and things like that as we get grades 3, 4, 5, and then into the more project in the way, picks up a lot of things.
As an engineer, I was really excited that the new standards were including some engineering principles. But so far, I haven't seen a lot of implementation of teaching engineering principles in a way that relates to 90% of the professional engineers that I've spoken to. And there's a lot of supplemental material out there which the engineering societies traditionally have provided to the students. Up to now, if you wanted to learn certain types of engineering or even learn engineering at all, you went to one of these outside programs provided by an engineering society. And I didn't see any of that material creeping into the formal curriculum. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I could.
So maybe if I could just clarify first your question. When you say creeping into the formal curriculum, I think if you look at NGSS, which is not the curriculum but the standards, the integration of the engineering along with the science practices is probably one of the major things that we would speak to as a shift from our current standards. Now there aren't, I mean, since NGSS has just been adopted and is not yet implemented in our schools, you won't see in a typical classroom much, achievement of those standards yet, but that is the goal. And those materials of the sort that you're talking about that engineering societies have created, or you mentioned Project Lead the Way, there are a lot of other great things that are out there. Now we'll have a much more interest, how do I say this? There's a lot of interest among our teachers now for materials and resources like that, because bringing in engineering into the K-12 science curriculum is something that we've now all committed to doing. I think the important thing to stress about the engineering is that it's not like another topic floating around there. It's part of looking at how the science affects our daily lives in all parts of the science that we're doing. So we may be learning some basic science through an engineering problem, or we might be learning some basic human biology and then looking at some interesting applications of that science with genomic medicine or whatever else. So it's not, the idea is that it will be very integrated in along with the science, because that's the way that the world of science and engineering is today in the 21st century.
We were speaking earlier about not having enough time for science. So what would you say would be enough time to achieve these standards? Would it be every day, twice a week? How often should kids be learning science?
Well, different districts have different schemes for allocating time, and there's no, I mean, it's not the role of standards to say, well, we should have block scheduling, or we should have, you know, X numbers of minutes per day or whatever. But if you actually look at the amount of time allocated to science, it has been dropping in the era of No Child Left Behind. I don't know if there's any magic number about the right number of minutes per school year, but certainly I think most of us who worked on NGSS and on the framework and are in the field of science education would say we probably need about the amount of time that's allocated to math and language arts for science. And I think most elementary teachers would in a way be very happy with that if they thought that that's what our society and our school systems wanted. The pressure has not been toward that in recent years.
It's important to point out, too, that in high school science classes, the time in science is equal to the other subject areas. I think we were referencing more the elementary school years. I think oftentimes elementary schools will flip-flop between social studies and science. They'll do a social studies unit and then a science unit. And in an ideal world, we'd have science every day, all year.
Any more questions? Close away, thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions? My name is Christina Lach. I'm the Executive Director for the Chicago Council on Science and Technology. And I just wanted to say a few words as a closure tonight. First of all, I would like to say thank you for the expert panel. I also wanted to emphasize that this program was recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, which is C2ST TV. This program will be also repeated on November 20th at Northwestern University within Chicago city limits. If you like this program, please consider coming to one of our upcoming programs. The Nature's Fortune, which is going to be on November 17th, or the Ebola program, which is going to be on November 19th, Women in STEM on December 3rd, which is going to be a great program for networking. I also wanted to say a big thank you for the Chicago Community Trust to support the organization and making this possible for C2ST to produce this excellent program. I also wanted to say a thank you for the Skokie Public Library hosting us here tonight. And thank you for watching, for those of you who joined us live stream. And thank you for all coming out tonight. Thank you again.